Please welcome Connor Gilson.
Thanks a lot. All right, thanks for that introduction, Ryan. Am I coming through in the back? Everyone can hear me okay? Awesome, great. So starting off the afternoon session here, I know that I'm going to be diving into some technical things. Energy might be a little low in the afternoon, so I'm going to request a little audience participation and invite everyone to stand where they are at their seat. So if you wouldn't mind standing up, thank you for indulging me. I assure you will be seated again momentarily. So for anyone standing who is a service provider, if you run a service or an application that users log into, please remain standing. Everyone else, thank you for your brief participation. Feel free to take a seat. Excellent. All right, just a couple. All right. So if your service supports two-factor authentication today, please remain standing. Otherwise, take a seat. All right, excellent, thank you. And for your service, if you know the two-factor authentication adoption rate among your end users, please remain standing. All right, now this is where I expected to lose a lot of folks, and we're going to talk about why that is, right? Now, the next thing I was going to use to assist people in sitting back down is talking about this 1% adoption rate. Now, this 1% slide is referencing in June 2016 when Dropbox announced that their adoption rate of two-factor among their end users was below 1%. Not that great. In addition, this 10% number, in January 2018, Google announced that two-factor adoption among their active user base was below 10%. Then we have a 28% number, and this is in November 2017. Duo Security ran a survey that found that about 28% of people, not specific to their product, but consumers in general, had enabled two-factor authentication on a service and were familiar. Now, 56% of people in this same survey didn't even know what two-factor authentication was before they took the survey. So that's a huge education gap. And finally, this 40% number is focusing a little bit more on the enterprise. In October 2017, the FIDO Alliance released a report called the State of Authentication, where they reported that 40% of enterprises leveraged at least two factors of authentication to secure access to their data and systems internally. So thank you for participating. I told you it would be brief, and thanks for the service providers who lasted a little bit longer than everyone else. But the big question I want everyone to think about, whether you're a service provider or not, even as an end user, why do services support two-factor authentication to begin with, right? Now, as a security engineer, I would like to think the answer to that question is because it's the right thing to do, right? We know it's going to be an avenue to better protect end user accounts, but I'm also a realist. So I realize companies need a specific motivation in order to add new functionality to their product, especially if it involves writing code. So what does that motivation tend to be for many companies? We've heard a lot about it today. It's compliance, right? Regardless of your industry, if you're trying to comply with a certain set of requirements, a lot of people take an approach, a lot of companies take an approach of looking for that silver bullet. They want to know what is the smallest amount of work I need to do and what are the boxes I need to check in order to comply. Now, unfortunately, I think the check the box approach to compliance is not the greatest, and it's kind of like this kitchen. So this kitchen, the contractor was required to install kitchen cabinets. Check, done. They were also required to install a stove. Check, we did that too. But when you look at the bigger picture, this is a pretty dysfunctional kitchen. And bolting on things, especially security features, can lead to products and services that look a lot like this kitchen. Now, because it's compliance and we have to do something anyway, we should take the opportunity to try to tie that to a business goal so we can actually get some value at the end of the day with something we have to do anyway. In the context of two-factor authentication, that business goal has to do with reducing the number of accounts that get hijacked by our end users. And There's a lot of reasons for that, obviously. If a lot of accounts are getting taken over, we're going to have unhappy users who might leave our service. We're going to have bad press, which no one wants. And we're also going to be not spending our internal resources on support staff and administrative overhead effectively. So with an increase in the adoption rate of two-factor, hopefully we can reduce the amount of unauthorized access that occurs, which is a lot easier to measure in terms of the end business goal. So in order to implement an effective two-factor strategy, there's much more than just a technical implementation. Now, as I mentioned, most people don't even know what two-factor authentication is. So we have to think about how to explain this in a way that people will understand and actually encourage them to use it and reduce any barriers for them to actually use it effectively. But of course, the technical implementation is the first milestone. If it's not there, they can't turn it on. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today in terms of understanding which methods are out there and some of the trade-offs between them. So there's three categories of authentication. There's three factors, and that's knowledge, possession, and inherence. Now, knowledge is quite self-explanatory, something you know. It's a password. The second, the possession category, is something you have. It might be a phone or a tablet. It could even be your laptop computer or a smart card. And USB security sticks, which we're going to talk a little bit about later on, falls into this category as well. Now, the inherence category, these are biometrics, something you are. And typically, biometrics don't play a large role today when authenticating to a remote web application, which is what I'm largely going to be focusing on. So we're going to limit the scope of two-factor authentication to something you know and something you have. And there's four methods I'm going to talk about today. The first is SMS, pretty self-explanatory. The second is time-based one-time passwords, or TOTP. If you've ever used Google Authenticator or Authy or any of these applications like that, you'll be familiar. The third method is push notifications. Google's implementation of this is called Google Prompt, and essentially just ask the end user, is this you trying to log in? Click yes or no. So we're going to dive into push, and we're going to finish by talking about universal second factor, or U2F, which are those USB security keys that I mentioned. So part of my goal here is to talk through a couple of rankings I shared not too long ago between these four methods. And the first ranking is according to security. How effective a job does each of these actually do at proving something you have? But in addition to that is the user experience. As everyone's familiar, if something's hard to use, people will just not use it. So this is a critical part of an effective two-factor implementation. And when you combine the two together, this is where we really start to think about which method for our service is going to be most effective for our end users. So the first method I want to start talking about is SMS. Now, a quick poll, you won't have to stand, but a show of hands. Who can receive a text message on a device that they have? Right? Everybody. Not a trick question. That is why SMS two-factor is so ubiquitous, but it also has a lot of vulnerabilities that we're going to talk through, which don't make it a very effective channel in terms of security for two-factor. So we're going to be following our fictitious friend Alice through a couple of workflows today. And in terms of SMS, she starts off the registration process by entering her phone number. And once she does this, the service provider will generate a one-time password with the goal of having Alice echo that back to prove that she owns her phone. Now, the phone company will send the text message to the device that is registered with that phone number. And the phrasing here is really important, and we'll come back to it, but it goes to the device that's registered with the phone number, and hopefully once Alice receives that, she can enter in her browser and complete the process. In terms of the daily login experience, it's basically identical, and Alice will kick that off by entering her password. So you can see in this slide, there's a big scary red box around the phone companies. And that is because the phone companies are a primary source of vulnerabilities when it comes to SMS for two-factor. And there's two categories we're going to talk about. The first is people, and the second is technical. And it's been mentioned today, but people are typically the weakest point in basically everything. So whether you call it SIM hijacking, SIM swapping, number porting, or SIM cloning, at the end of the day, these are all approaches that involves social engineering, tricking someone at the phone company to make a change based on impersonating someone else's identity. And you can see that after attackers accomplish this and make changes to SIM cards, they can use the password they've obtained elsewhere to log into an account, which, as expected, generates a one-time password that gets sent to the phone company. And this is where we come back to our specific phrasing. The text is now being sent to the device registered with that phone number. And because of the SIM changes, that's no longer Alice's phone, it's the attacker's phone. So of course, once the attackers get that, they can use the one-time password to log into Alice's account. Now this is not a theoretical problem. This happens all the time. This is an example from June 2016 where a Black Lives Matter activist had SMS two-factor enabled on his account, but through social engineering attacks on his SIM cards, through Verizon, they were able to sidestep that and get into his account. In December 2016, Forbes and many others reported that people sidestepped SMS two-factor using social engineering approaches and were able to steal millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin. In addition, the New York Times reported that this trend is only continuing to increase. So many people might be thinking, well, the phone company needs to do a better job verifying identities before they go making these changes, right? Now, as we've heard about today, this proves to be more difficult with all of our information that's floating around on the internet. And obviously, thanks to Equifax, this is becoming more and more of a challenge as time goes by. T-Mobile in February 2018 sent a text to the majority of their user base to inform them of an industry-wide phone hijacking scam. This sounds pretty bad, and they have a page on their website dedicated to this. Obviously, no one can read that, so zooming in a little bit, we see that our industry is experiencing a phone number port-out scam that could impact you. This sounds very bad. They do have some recommendations on the page, and one of them is to consider checking with your bank to see if there's an alternative to using text per PIN authentication. To me, that sounds a lot like don't use SMS for two-factor, right? Now, in addition to the people problems, there are some technical problems with the phone network. And one of these has to do with Signal System 7, or SS7. Now, if you're not familiar with this, it's a series of protocols that handles routing phone calls and text messages throughout the global phone network. It was originally created back in the 70s, and shockingly, 40 years later or more, it's still at the core of the phone network today. Now, SS7, when it was designed, security was not top of mind, and it remains inherently vulnerable to abuse today. So we can see back in this diagram, once the hackers log in with the password they've stolen, it will generate the one-time password as usual. And the phone company now, the attackers can exploit SS7 to redirect the text to their phone, and Alice is sitting in the corner unaware of what's going on. Once they obtain that, of course, they're in her account. Now, SS7 vulnerabilities have been known about for a long, long time, but there have been some demonstrations recently that really drive this point home. In May 2016, Positive Technologies demonstrated exploitations on SS7 to hijack WhatsApp accounts, and WhatsApp accounts deal with text messages. You see the problem. A company was created specifically to profit from exploiting SS7 and other problems with the phone network. And in addition, in May 2017, many different outlets reported that many German bank accounts were completely drained after attackers sidestepped SMS 2FA. And this is stealing real money, right? I mean, you can argue Bitcoin is real money or not, but this proved to a lot of people that SS7 exploiting it is a much more scalable and realistic attack vector than people have thought in the past. So moving away from the phone network briefly, we're going to talk about phishing, which has been brought up a couple of times today. And Google and UC Berkeley came out with a paper that basically drew the same conclusion that phishing is the #1 most effective way to hijack an account. Now, SMS is very vulnerable to phishing attacks. Once Alice logs into the site she thinks is legitimate, the phishers will, of course, turn around, use that password to log into the real website, which will trigger a one-time password to be sent through the phone company, and this will go to Alice's actual phone. But she thinks she's logging into a real website. And she knows she has SMS two-factor enabled, so she's expecting to get this text message. So of course, she's going to enter the password, the one-time password, and once she does, they're in her account. So hopefully you can see that though everyone has the ability to receive a text, in terms of proving something you have, SMS doesn't do such a good job. Now, it is really important to point out that SMS two-factor is unquestionably better than no two-factor at all. So that debate has happened many times and will continue to happen. But the important thing is to favor a more secure method if that's an option for your users. So this brings us to our second method, time-based one-time passwords. And we'll see that it is significantly more secure, but does have some usability trade-offs. So running through the registration flow for Alice, after she starts that, the service provider will display a QR code and prompt her to scan that with an authentication app on her trusted device. Now, if this is the first time that Alice has ever interacted with TOTP, of course, she won't have one, and she'll have to go install that application. And once she has that app, she'll scan the QR code, and something really important happens in this step. And that is that a shared secret is saved on Alice's trusted device. And there are two important things to take away from the shared secret. The first is that it is shared. It's on Alice's trusted device, and it's on the server. The second is that the shared secret is secret. No one else should have a copy. And if you're thinking, well, of course, someone's just going to steal it, yeah, we're going to come back to that. It is definitely a problem. Of course, once this is done, Alice can look at the 6-digit code displayed on her device and finish out the process. So this is an example of Google Authenticator. You can see there's an entry for each account that Alice has set up. And there's also a countdown on the right-hand side. A new code will be generated every 30 seconds. So this is a screenshot from my phone. You can see I have more than one authentication app. But unlike many people, I love two-factor and research the different options out there. But important point is that Alice only needs to install one of these devices. And they all implement TOTP, which is an algorithm we're going to talk a little bit about. And they can all generate the same codes. So the next time Alice comes across a service that supports TOTP, she'll have a little bit easier time setting it up using the existing app that she already has. On the day-to-day login process, things are even easier yet. And after Alice enters her password, all she has to do is take out her trusted device, look up the 6-digit code, and enter it into the browser. Now, the important thing to highlight here is that there's no phone company. There's no scary red box. And TOTP does have its own problems we'll talk about. But by not needing the phone company, we have a security benefit, avoiding all those vulnerabilities. But we also have a usability benefit. These codes are generated locally on her trusted device, so she doesn't need a network connection of any kind. This can be really helpful, especially if you're traveling and your networks are changing constantly. So you might be thinking, OK, as a service provider, how do I know Alice is giving me the correct 6-digit code? And the way that everything works under the hood for TOTP is that it uses an HMAC. And an HMAC relies on a cryptographic hash function. And without diving into all of the weeds here, there's one really important property of cryptographic hash functions that make this work, and that is determinism. The same inputs will always provide the same outputs. So you can see that the shared secret and the current time are used as inputs to this hash. That calculation can be run on the trusted device to generate the one-time password, and it can also be generated on the server. So that way, we just compare the values and make sure it's the same. Now, I should point out, if someone just gets incredibly lucky and guesses the correct 6 digits, they're going to get in. So this is not the strongest security posture, but we'll talk a little bit about how that changes for some other methods. So in addition, TOTP has its own vulnerabilities. And this is back to the idea that someone's going to steal the shared secret, because of course they are. And the first place that it could be stolen is from the service provider themselves. Now, it's the responsibility of service providers to make sure we're storing this shared secret securely. No one has perfect security. And if a data breach does occur, we don't want the shared secret to be leaked, because then anyone can generate valid OTPs like we just talked about. And we can't store it as a hash like we might a password, because we need the actual original shared secret value to run the calculation to generate OTPs. So instead of hashing, we're going to encrypt the shared secret and store it in our database encrypted. Now, this is a great strategy, but anytime you start dealing with encryption, you deal with encryption key management, which is a huge problem. If you store the key directly next to the encrypted content and they both get leaked, you've accomplished a whole lot of nothing. So there are, of course, solutions. You could use a hardware security module or something like that. But the point is that the service provider does have information that could nullify TOTP two-factor if it's not secured correctly and it gets compromised. Now, the second place that the secret could be stolen is from Alice's trusted device. It could be as simple as she loses her phone, and in that case, it's very unlikely that someone who comes across her phone on the sidewalk will also have her password. So hopefully she has enough time to log into her account, rotate her secrets, and then anyone who finds the phone can't do anything with it anyway. Now, Alice could also be targeted specifically by someone who has her password. And of course, we don't want anything to happen to her devices, but this is actually two-factor authentication succeeding. Someone can launch a remote attack to steal her password, but because the possession category intends to be something you physically have, if they have to come and physically take her device, that's a significantly higher bar that requires a different type of attack. It is worth noting that Alice should turn on full disk encryption and do all those other good things to protect her trusted devices. Just like SMS, TOTP is vulnerable to phishing attacks. And in a very similar pattern, Alice will log into what she thinks is a legitimate site. The phishers will log into the real site, and the real site will say, we need your one-time password. So being smart phishers, they'll say, hey, Alice, can you just tell us what the one-time password is? That would be really helpful. And because Alice thinks that she's on a legit website, she's expecting to have to enter something. She's going to follow through with that, and as soon as she does, her account is compromised. So of course, there are some usability trade-offs that I highlighted, or I hinted at, and one of them is, what if you lose this trusted device? How are you going to get back in your account? Well, the really common strategy is to offer recovery codes that are good for one-time use, but TOTP also has another option, which is to use multiple trusted devices. If you've got a phone and a tablet, you can scan that QR code during the registration process and maybe leave your tablet at home. Then if you lose your phone, you can still log into your account, and you don't have to keep track of your recovery codes. So there's some options here, but of course now you need to secure these devices, understand where your shared secrets are ending up, and make sure all of that is accounted for. Ironically, there are some annoyances using apps depending on how many accounts are registered. So if Alice is being a good security citizen and enabling two-factor TOTP anywhere she can, she's eventually going to get a very long list of accounts that she has to scroll through every time she goes to log in. Now, of course, this isn't the end of the world, but if you have to do this every time you log in, that's pretty annoying. In addition, you can see the countdown clock is a little less than half here. And if I'm feeling ambitious and don't want to wait for a fresh code to appear, I can look at that, get the first 3 digits, put that into the phone, or the computer rather, and by the time I look back, the code has changed. I don't know what the second 3 digits are. I have to start again. Again, an annoyance, but all of these add up, and they're barriers that people don't want to deal with, so they're just not going to use two-factor. So hopefully you can see why TOTP is so much more secure than SMS and does a better job proving something you have, but it does have its own problems. A lot of those are related to user experience, but on the security side, if the service provider gets compromised, that's not an ideal property and one that we want to address. So this brings us to the third method, push notifications. Now, push notifications can be a bit of a hassle to set up initially, but once they're working for the daily login experience, it's quite nice. So this is a little difficult to see because it's small, but essentially this is Google prompt saying, Connor, is this you trying to log in? Click the yes button if it is, click the no button if it's not. Brain dead simple, a lot easier than manually entering something, a lot less annoying. So let's take a look at the registration process for push. And once Alice starts it, the service provider is going to prompt her to install an application. Now, unlike TOTP, this application tends to be specific to the service that you're registering two-factor on. So we'll come back to that in a minute, but the other important thing is that Alice also needs to authenticate in the mobile app. Once she does this, what's actually happening under the hood is that a public key is being shared with the service provider. And now this use of public key cryptography is important to how push works. We'll see it again in the authentication flow in a minute. But the important thing to highlight is that this solves the problem of a compromise happening at the service provider. If one does occur, there's no shared secret anymore like TOTP. Public keys are not enough in order to authenticate, like we'll see. So public key crypto here is the magic under the hood. Now, of course, Alice will click yes to finish out the registration process. And she'll see a similar process during her daily login flow. Now, once she gets puts in her password, she'll get this notification. And the important thing to highlight here is that this notification does not include any secrets. It does not include any one-time passwords. It doesn't even include information about the session that is trying to be authenticated. What it does do is say, hey, app running on the phone, connect to the service provider on a secure connection. And relying on the key pair that was generated during the registration flow, this can be a mutually authenticated connection. And then we're going to share information about the session we're trying to authenticate. Maybe we'll tell you the device it came from, the estimated geographic area, et cetera. And if Alice is legitimately trying to log in, she can click yes. And what actually happens under the hood here is that Alice is using the private key on her trusted device to send a signed message to the service provider. And once the service provider gets that, they can validate that signature with the public key and have a much stronger trust signal that this actually came from Alice's trusted device. It wasn't someone who got lucky guessing 6 numbers. So this is a huge step forward in security. But of course, like anything else, push has its own vulnerabilities. And well, maybe surprising some, but you can sense the trend here. Phishing is a problem as well. So once Alice enters her password to what she thinks is a real site, they're going to turn around, log in, and this will trigger the push notification be sent to her phone. Now again, Alice thinks she's on a real site and is expecting to receive this push notification. So there's a good chance that she might click yes and give them access, which would be a huge bummer. But push does have some information about where this authentication attempt is coming from. So there is an opportunity to avoid that, but let's dig into this just a little bit deeper. Now, this is a highly scientific phishing site that I just made on my computer. It's Google with zeros instead of O's, so it's going to trick everyone. And if Alice comes to this, she's obviously not looking at the URL, right? She's relying on quick visual cues, looking at the Google logo, and she's probably really busy like everyone else and just wants to log into her account. So she's relying on muscle memory. What do I have to do in order to get logged in? Similarly, this is the actual push notification she'll get. She's going to rely on the visual cue. She sees Google. She's expecting to receive this push and probably isn't going to read the information in the middle because she already didn't check the URL. Relying on muscle memory, she's probably going to click yes. If she doesn't, she's avoided the phish. That's great. But everyone who clicks yes is going to allow people to get right into their account. So I mentioned that the service provider typically needs their own app for push to work. And for Google Prompt, on Android, it's less of a burden because it's actually built into the Google Play Services application, which is pretty much running on all Android phones. It does work on iOS, but you need to install the Google Search app. LastPass is another one shown here. You need to have the LastPass app for push to work for your LastPass account, and similarly for Namecheap. Now, Duo Mobile and Authy, shown on the bottom, are 2 authentication providers that you can essentially utilize for two-factor. And I just highlight these because any service that integrates with these Duo or Authy on the back end, their end users are not going to need multiple apps. They're just going to need the Duo app, and that will work for any service that integrates with Duo on the back end. But of course, service providers need to run their own cost-benefit analysis because these companies aren't charities. They charge you money, right? So similarly, if you lose your trusted device, you need a backup method. And for push, that's most likely going to be recovery codes, though some service providers might support sending a push notification to multiple devices. So that would be dependent completely upon the service provider's implementation. So hopefully you can see why push is more secure. Using public key crypto eliminates the shared secret. That's a great step forward. But the most important takeaway, in my opinion, is that it's really, really simple to use. And getting people to use anything can be a challenge. Getting them to click a button can be much easier. So now our fourth and final method of two-factor, universal second factor, or U2F. Now, you can see it's ranked right at the top of my list for security, and we're going to talk through why that is. But it's ranked towards the bottom for user experience. And the reason is that there's some significant barriers to adoption, certainly in the consumer space. In the enterprise space, this can be a little different, where there are more resources and there's a team of people to make some of the technical decisions required to make this work. But let's take a look at what universal second factor might look like for an average consumer. Now, the first step is that you have to purchase a piece of hardware. Now, just like shown up there, I've got my security key here. And when I purchase this, I'm sure many people do the same. I go to Amazon anytime I need to buy anything, and I type in whatever I'm looking for. So I look in U2F security key, a bunch of stuff pops up. I know what I'm looking for, but the average consumer who doesn't know even what two-factor authentication is stands no chance to understand what they're looking at here. Right? They're not going to know the brands. They're not going to know the price ranges. Is this physical piece of hardware going to work for my phone and my computer, or the websites I even want to use it on? It's a bit of a challenge. Now, Yubico is a company that was involved in originally creating the U2F spec in the first place. And on their website, they have a really helpful quiz that asks plain English questions for anybody to understand that will identify which of their products could meet their use case. Now, while this is really helpful, you have to know this exists in order to use it, right? So someone who goes to Amazon is kind of out of luck. There's a pretty good chance they're going to buy something that might not work. If they want it to work with their phone, for example, my security key only works with my laptop. So I could purchase a Yubico key that does work with my phone over NFC or low-energy Bluetooth. But while this one costs $18, the Bluetooth or NFC ones are going to start at $50. So someone who's not even going to consider enabling two-factor over SMS, spending money is a huge barrier, and going from $18 to $50 is even higher barrier yet. So let's take a look at the registration flow for universal two-factor. Now, after starting the registration process, Alice will insert her security key, tap it with her finger, and then that's the end of the process. Pretty great, pretty simple. Now, this is actually hiding quite a bit of complexity under the hood. And what's happening here is that a unique key pair is being generated, and it's being bound to whatever origin we're registering. So for example, Google. A unique key pair is generated and bound to Google. And we're going to come back to how this key pair is used, but you can see the public key crypto use here, just like push, avoids issues if a breach happens at the service provider. So now the actual login flow for Alice is also quite similar. She'll put in her password, enter her security key to her USB port, and tap it with her finger. And that's it. Process over again. Quite simple. And this is hiding a lot of technical complexity under the hood that we're going to talk a little bit about. So what's actually happening here is that the service provider is generating a challenge. And they're sending this challenge to the browser, who then sends the challenge along with the current origin to the security key. Now, the security key can ask itself the question, do I have a key that I've generated previously that is bound to the origin I've just been given? If the answer is no, like Google spelled with zeros instead of Google, my highly scientific phishing page, then the process just ends. There's nothing to do. So the U2F protocol is inherently vulnerable to, not vulnerable, resistant, huge distinction. It is resistant to phishing attacks, right? In addition, it's resistant to most man-in-the-middle attacks for the same reason. The only types of man-in-the-middles, or some that it is not resistant to, is if someone obtains a CA and correctly impersonates an origin or a domain, right? But this is a huge step forward on the security side of things. If the key pair does exist, then the private key will be used to sign the challenge, get sent back to the browser, and eventually ends back at the service provider where they can use the public key to verify that signature. If everything checks out, authentication complete, Alice is logged in. So of course, nothing is without its usability problems. And the first is that you need to have actually access to your laptop. Mine is under that stack of papers, and yes, that is my actual desk. Once you actually get your computer, you need to have an open USB port to use. Now this sounds simplistic, but on the left-hand side, I have my webcam plugged in. On the right-hand side, I have my keyboard and mouse plugged in. I work in desktop mode 99% of the time. So I need to unplug my webcam, plug in the USB security key, tap it, and then plug my webcam back in. Again, not the end of the world, but these are additional barriers to the flow of two-factor, and the average person doesn't want to do any extra steps at all, so this can be a source of annoyance. You might be thinking, just buy a USB hub. That's totally valid, but again, that's more financial investment. So what happens if I lose my security key? Need a recovery process just like any other method. Now, if I purchase multiple security keys and register them, I can have a primary and I can have a backup. So at home in my house is my backup key. If this one disappears, I'm not locked out of my account permanently, and I don't necessarily need to rely on recovery codes, which are the second option. But of course, purchasing multiple keys requires more money. It's a much more viable approach in the enterprise, but for the average consumer, that's going to be a challenge. So hopefully you can see why U2F is right at the top of the security scale. It's resistant to phishing attacks. It's resistant to most man-in-the-middle attacks. And the service provider becoming compromised, the only thing that's getting exposed there are public keys, which is another great security property. It does have its own usability challenges, but the biggest hurdle to adoption is financial. I should note that there's a new spec just announced, or recently just got a lot of press, called WebAuthn, which is essentially FIDO U2F version 2.0. It's being standardized with a bunch of people, and so it would be really interesting to follow that throughout the rest of the year and see what adoption rates that might help increase. So least common denominator is a really important thing to consider in terms of the larger picture of providing an effective two-factor implementation. Now, if a user has an option between multiple methods and opts to use a security key, a U2F security key, they're expecting a certain level of security. But if they don't understand the security trade-offs between these methods and also enable SMS as a backup, well, now their account is vulnerable to all the problems that are associated with SMS. So as service providers, we have a responsibility to do everything within our power to educate our users so they can make informed decisions between these methods. But it's even bigger than that. Who has ever gone through an account recovery process where they just texted you a code, right? I have. I'm sure others have. If I enabled U2F two-factor, but the account recovery process is SMS, attackers aren't going to bother with your security key. They're going to say, oh, I lost it. Send me a text, right? And along those same lines, it's important for service providers to make sure that our support staff is trained and has the appropriate tools or lack of tools to make sure that they can't sidestep two-factor unless a defined process is followed, right? So in order to implement an effective two-factor strategy, like I talked about in the beginning, the technical implementation is the first milestone, but don't stop there. We need to help educate our users about why this is so important, how they can use it, how it works. We need to work with designers to make sure that the process is easy to understand, tech writers to make sure that there's documentation if they get stuck. Many different departments within company are going to be required to make sure that the adoption rates can be as high as possible. And we don't have time, obviously, to talk about that today. I would love to get another talk together. So if that sounds interesting, please come say hello after. I'll take that as motivation to get a second talk together that maybe we can give another time down the road. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. If there are any questions, please don't hesitate. Any questions out there? All right, looks like Ryan might have one.
Besides the end user and the financial aspect, what might be another hurdle to implementing this U2F system for users?
Are you thinking in like an enterprise context for a company?
Yes.
Yeah. So there are a lot of companies that are using U2F internally. Google's using it, Facebook is using it, I think Salesforce is using it, and it's not surprising. It's a much more achievable method to use in the enterprise where IT staff who can work on this project can determine which hardware to get, which hardware not to get. They can hand out keys. Really, I think the financial is a big part, but it's just a logistical challenge like anything else to make sure that all the employees have the keys they need, both a primary, a backup, making sure they have them synced, and if they lose them, having processes in place to make sure that they can get a new primary key, because if you only ever have one, you want to make sure that you have that backup. So it's really just logistics, but I think finance is the big motivator because you have to purchase that hardware. Yeah. Any other questions? Great. Well, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.